The other day, my daughter did a science experiment in school. I don't remember the details exactly, something about plants. It was the type of science experiment that a lot of us probably did as kids, with an independent variable and a dependent variable. Something like change the amount of water that's going to the plants, watch how differently the plants grow. It's the kind of experiment that leaves you with the impression that X causes Y. End of story. This type of philosophy or approach to thinking about climate leads to a few assumptions. It makes us think that there's a knowable number, that we can predict exactly how much it's going to warm or exactly how much sea levels are going to rise. It also encourages us to think we have enough time to fix this problem. It's not so urgent. I'm one of these types of people, kind of obsessive, who's always fixated on numbers, especially numbers that are frequently updated. So when you think of that person who's constantly looking at election polls, constantly checking sports statistics, that's me. At some point in the summer of 2007, I started to realize that Arctic sea ice, that ice that sits on top of the Arctic Ocean, was trending really, really low. And as we started to get towards the end of the summer, I started watching those numbers every day to see how low the Arctic sea ice was going to go. But I never could have predicted what actually happened that summer. Arctic sea ice crashed to levels far below anything that had been seen in the last 50 years. And suddenly, we started to realize that Arctic sea ice could go to levels that climate models predicted wouldn't happen before the year 2100. Some of the leading bodies thinking about climate science, like the IPCC, had predicted that we couldn't see sea ice drop to those levels until perhaps 2100 or maybe 2050. So I got to thinking about why this happened. Were the climate models missing something important? And then we got to thinking, if the climate models are missing this, what else could they be missing? What if changes in Arctic sea ice change the everyday weather patterns across populous parts of the United States, parts of Europe, parts of Asia? Could the models be missing that too? Missing just how much the strength of heat waves could change or how long they'd last? Missing the sequence of rainfall that crops rely on? Missing how all these complicated system components fit together? But the bottom line is I started to really realize, that the Earth might be far more sensitive to greenhouse gases than we had thought. Now, that's the climate system, but there's also the issue of what happens to impacts, what happens to the systems that we care so much about, whether it's crops, whether it's the economy. Those systems too could be more sensitive in a nonlinear way to a given amount of warming than we thought they were. And once we start to realize that if you increase temperatures just an extra degree or two on the hottest days, it's not like a little more people will die of overheating or crop yields will drop a few percent. In some cases, you can start to approach a cliff where it becomes so hot that people can't work outdoors. The demand for air conditioning doesn't go up a little, it shoots up. Crop yields don't just drop a little, they fall off a cliff. And if crop yields do drop even a little, what are the nonlinear impacts on people and societies? A little bit of a drop in crop yields in some places is not a minor issue. It might be the difference between having enough food to survive and not surviving. It might be the difference between the social system in a country being stable and there being intense conflict. One example closer to home was Hurricane Sandy. Whereas some people, for example, in New York City or parts of the Caribbean, experienced devastating effects of Hurricane Sandy. Inundation of buildings, even loss of life. Up by me in the Hudson Valley, 50 miles north of New York City, the effects were pretty minor, basically just a lot of wind. But still, everybody freaked out. I remember seeing people lining up what seemed like a half a mile and waiting hours for gas, just out of fear. So that shows how vulnerable we can be even to small stressors. Similarly, a lot of the leading utilities and infrastructure managers in the New York area had planned for a storm like Sandy. but they hadn't necessarily thought about this intricate web of connection. They hadn't necessarily thought about the fact that they might not be able to pump water out, for example, if the electricity was out at the same time. Today, as we look across the West at fires raging out of control, much sooner than our climate models would have suggested this would be possible, we have to also ask here if we've underestimated the speed and intensity of climate change, and if we've underestimated the impacts as well. We could be very close to the day when insurers out West begin to say, we are not going to protect against these wildfires anymore. We may be close to the day when insurers start to say, we are not going to offer policies against these wildfires anymore. And when that day happens, we could see cascading impacts in terms of loss of property values quickly, loss of ability to fund critical infrastructure. The system could change very, very fast. So the bottom line is that we risk losing control of this narrative. Even if we somehow could knock our emissions back down, we won't go back to the exact same planet as before because of these powerful tipping points. But just because there's no going back doesn't mean there's no future. It's not hopeless. We can't get there with gradual changes, just reducing our emissions a little, because the pace of climate change is no longer gradual. But can we counter those climate tipping points with some positive tipping points of our own? Just like our climate models have underestimated how fast it might warm and how much people might be affected, we may have also underestimated just what people can do, just how quickly people can change. Could human responsiveness to the climate threat also change faster than we think? We alone, including you, will decide whether we'll make those shifts that are needed. And I know we can do it.